Hi everyone, I'm Jerome Heno. I'm going to share today's seminar. We're just going to give a few minutes to let everyone arrive, and then Susan Newman will introduce the seminar series. I hope you don't mind that we record the seminar. If you have any issues, just let us know on the chat. But we're very excited about today's presentation and discussion. And I'll say a few more words in a minute after Susan has introduced the series, because today is the first this year. But yeah, let's give it a few more minutes for more people to join in, and then I'll give the floor to Susan. Uh, we can probably, if Antonio doesn't mind, share the slides, but yeah, he seems okay with it. Yeah, so yeah, the seminar can be available um, in print or PDF. I can see numbers of participants growing, so that's good. Right. Should we? I don't know, Susan. Should we start? Do we want to? Don't want to take too much time waiting for others. But I don't want your introduction to not be heard. So
Yeah, well, why not? I mean, as we wait for people, before we do the proper introductions, perhaps I can just welcome everybody to the seminar. Yeah, my name's Susan Newman. I'm a professor of economics at the Open University. And as Jerome mentioned, today's seminar, is jointly organised between the economics discipline at the Open University and the Innovation, Knowledge and Inclusive Development Group, IKID, which is a cross-disciplinary research group here at the Open University looking at questions of international development. And this is the first of 5 seminars that we'll be running in this series in 2026 that will run until May, once a month, covering all sorts of issues pertaining to gender, ecology, civil society, and even and varieties of methods and approaches to studies within development studies. One thing I should say that I think is quite special about this series, or the way that we're doing this, and you'll see this in terms of the discussant who's been invited to join, is that we think it's very important that these dialogues that take place in the seminars are not just within academia, but are genuine dialogues between academia and practitioners, be it civil society, advocacy groups, campaign groups, policymakers, etc. So this is something that's very important to us in this series, and I'm very grateful to have the 2 speakers here who reflect those 2 sides and the importance of translating research into practical activities. So I would just, yeah, that's all I was going to say about the series, and hopefully I wasted enough time so that there's now lots of people in the room. So I'll hand back to Jerome, who is chairing today's seminar.
hi everyone, thanks Susan. Hi, welcome everyone to this first seminar, and we're very excited to welcome Antonio Andreoni and Rina Lasner on presenting and discussing a very important topic of our global economic systems and global value change and structural asymmetries, and especially the power relationships and power at place in understanding the barriers of industrial policy to make those structural transformation effective for different objectives. So very excited to welcome Professor Antonio Andreoni, who will be the main presenter for about 40 minutes. I'm just going to introduce him formally, and then I'll introduce Rina when the discussion takes place in a minute. So Antonio is a professor of development economics at the Department of Economics of SOAS, University of London, and co-director of the SOAS Center for Sustainable Structural Transformations. He's published extensively on industrial development and policy and conducted extensive fieldwork in Southern and Eastern Africa. And he's been advising international organizations and governments for over 15 years, as well as being a member of the South African Presidential Economic Advisory Council. So yes, I'll probably give you the floor now, Antonio, and we'll check with you just 5 minutes before time's up. So between 35 and 40 minutes for your presentations. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jerome. Thanks, Susan. Thanks everyone who decided to join, and thanks particularly to Rina who agreed to discuss some of the issues that I will raise today in this presentation. Particularly pleased to engage this community. I mean, several scholars across Open University have contributed to this topic in many different ways, and in a way I'm planning to present both work that has been done over the last few years, but also ongoing work on exactly this issue of, as Jerome was stressing, around how we understand the current challenges that countries face when, if you want, the door to industrial policy is open. We don't need to convince any more governments about the importance of that. There is, in some cases, some open policy space that could be filled with new intervention, but despite all of this, governments struggle to address a significant amount of pressure that is coming from different angles. It's coming from, of course, geopolitical context. It's coming from the way in which value chains are still structured and the asymmetries that make difficult for countries to engage with international markets, with technologies and so on. So I will try to combine a number of these reflections and bring in a number of empirical studies that in a way I think will help fleshing out exactly these issues. Lots of the work that I will be presenting, also recent work, has been developed as part of the Center for Sustainable Structural Transformation, where industrial policy is central across a number of different areas for intervention. I'm particularly pleased that Rina is here. We have collaboration with the Center for Competition Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg, where I'm also affiliated. Now, the seminar will try to do three things, basically. I would like to start by really reflecting on what we understand about how countries, especially in the, if you want, late industrialization experience, have engaged with value chains in a strategic way, and how this strategic engagement is becoming more and more difficult for different pressures or compression mechanisms. Here I'm referring to the work that Hag Whittaker, Tim Sturgeon, and others have done on the idea of a potential shift in the development regime starting from the 90s, where some element of compression have made more difficult to engage with industrialization, structural transformation. And here I would like to help the discussion framing the key challenges in terms of the, if you want, to what has become a common narrative, which is the so-called middle income trap, or what in work we've done with Fiona Tregen and others, we have rephrased as a middle income technology trap. And I will try to explain what really are the key issues in this respect. This will provide a sort of foundation to look at the current industrial policy space, and in a way why we need to think about how countries can engage with industrial policy in a way that I hope from the presentation will become clearer, moves away from standard industrial policy forms and really refocus on the core of the industrial policy functions. And here we try to build on a distinction that is helpful in terms of institutional design, but also industrial policy instruments design. And this kind of distinction is not theoretical, it's very actually applied, very practical. We can see this kind of problem emerging in several cases, in particular in the new application of industrial policy for green transition, where countries are trying to rethink several instruments from procurement to grants to subsidies to the management of demand. And in doing that, they often struggle to use the potential instruments in a way that it's more feasible and more conducive to the outcome that they are trying to achieve. And of course, in the design of these policies, we increasingly see, has always been the case, but we increasingly see how the industrial policy has become a very contested space where multiple actors bring in their influence in the policy design process, even more importantly, the implementation and enforcement of these policies. And here in particular, we have been looking at how multinational corporations, and I will try to emphasize that, have to be brought in into the discussion around the domestic and international political economy of industrial policy, because we have seen how they have become even more powerful in shaping the direction of travel of certain type of technologies and certain type of markets. Now, let me just start, as I already mentioned, of course, the idea that late industrialization is happening in a, or not happening. Many countries are stuck in a situation of premature deindustrialization and multiple challenges to transform their economies. This goes back, of course, to the work of Alice Amsden and many of the scholars who have been looking at the experience of those few countries that managed to escape from a condition of underdevelopment, or what, as I mentioned before, has been defined a middle income trap. And many contributions have emphasized what are the compression mechanisms, what are the reasons why so many countries have over time struggled to not simply jump in the income category, but fundamentally at the structural level, at the institutional level, change their economies and societies. You can look at this kind of trap in different ways. You can look at how countries have caught up with the income threshold, the moving income threshold, or you can look at how they have filled the gap against the income threshold. And the immediate thing that we see is that very few countries have been able in a sustained way to reduce this gap or approaching the high income threshold. I mean, China, it's clearly the striking case of a countries which not only managed to approach and very soon moving towards graduating into an upper income and high income level, but also one that has been able to lift up a significant large population into this journey. Many of the other large middle income countries, and I will talk about South Africa later in more detail, are countries who have struggled to fundamentally engage with the tensions, the problems that characterize structurally this kind of economies. Now, what are these problems? If we look at the middle income trap from simply a World Bank or a standard kind of perspective, we tend to think about general economic growth problem. But if we open the box of what is the structure and what are the structural bottlenecks that impede these economies from transforming, we can fundamentally identify four mechanisms, four structural mechanisms that are also institutional, because involve the way in which different actors are engaging with markets, with institutions, and of course with industrial policy. Now, the first is what in this paper with Fiona Tregenna we defined the challenge of breaking into the global economy, and in particular the challenge due to the increasing global concentration, both at the sectoral level and in terms of large corporations. I will go to provide some evidence about each one of them in a second. The second one is not simply about breaking into the global economy, but actually finding ways to link up into the global value chain while capturing opportunities for learning, development and accumulation of productive capabilities, development of markets and technologies. This challenge of linking up becomes even more significant when countries are not simply trying to gain some position in some segment of value chain, but when they try fundamentally to link back their companies and develop the local production system, which means transforming the relationship with this value chain from one in which they are simply supplier of low value components to one in which they're able to increase the domestic value addition, and with that translate, which is not automatic, but creating the condition to translate that increasing value addition into employment, better employment, more investment in innovation. And ultimately, this linking back process is often connected to not simply a quantitative a change in terms of domestic value addition, but a qualitative change, which refers to the kind of technological content that countries and companies in these countries can bring in. And here the problem is to how to keep pace with that technological change. Now, let me provide some example and evidence that make these four dimensions helpful in terms of our analysis of current middle-income countries, as well as reflecting on the experience of countries who managed to escape from empire or escape from that kind of trap. Now, the first dimensions around breaking into the global economy has to do with understanding how, while we've seen an increasing presence of middle-income countries in domestic value addition in the manufacturing sector and the tradable sector internationally, most of this change has been, of course, driven by China, in particular in the period pre-financial crisis, and after that, more again, a change in terms of the quality of what, and so the technological content of what is exported internationally. When we look at this concentration, we look at specific countries and how these countries have engaged with this fundamental entrance of new players and increasing closure of opportunities to engage on with value chains, and we look at countries like South Africa, for example, we see how these countries have become extremely integrated with China from the point of view of importing goods from these economies. This is a chart which depicts the last pretty much 20 years of South Africa engagement with China. You see how import penetration from China became more significant, and of course China became the first South African trade partner. But at the same time, that was associated with a shock in the domestic economy, not because China was fundamentally impeding the economy from investing. In fact, many opportunities for engagement with the Chinese markets also materialized later on. The big problem was that the significant strengthening of the Chinese manufacturing system was happening at a speed, at an intensity that was not comparable with countries like South Africa and others who were also trying to move away from their premature industrialization or middle-income trap situation. And when we did some work in trying to understand how this engagement was working in terms of value chain, so how the import penetration on specific segment of the value chain was affecting directly the sector in which the product was imported, as well as upstream and downstream. So how much the sectors that were supplying the production of this product and those that were buying that were affected, we could find clear evidence that the China shock was as much as an international shock given to this increasing concentration of this value chain, as was also a domestic shock given to the fact that firms were reacting to this increasing pressure very differently. And this doesn't matter. We found econometric evidence that fundamentally the disruption of this global concentration and this breaking into is really dependent on the extent to which companies in the countries that are affected by this shock are willing to and capable to invest in their capabilities. And there is a clear difference in terms of the impact of this shock across firms. So there is huge heterogeneity into that. Now, the breaking into is really a China story. The multinationals, players that have been, of course, engaging with the new restructuring of this value chain internationally. But it's also a story around how countries try to promote their linking back, while at the same time their multinationals and OEMs and so on were linking up. Now, Kyung Lee has produced a very interesting chart about the experience of late industrialization of South Korea, where from his point of view, the experience of South Korea was successful because fundamentally, among other ingredients, the country was able to engage strategically with the GVC by getting into, so linking up in the first period from the 70s, 80s, and then sort of linking back, which is a phase in which the economy became much more dependent on domestic value addition. So a phase of getting in the global economy, a phase where partially there was a substitution of what was imported from international companies with domestic companies, and then again going back into the global economy, but now with an industrial base that is able to master technologies. We have redone the same type of analysis with China, and what you see, it's an even more striking pattern here. You see when you compare the trend in domestic value addition vis-a-vis foreign value addition, which means how much you are domestically adding value to what you are able to export vis-a-vis how much this comes from imported goods. You can see clearly how China shares of foreign value added in gross exports, so the amount of value that was embedded in the products that China was exporting, was growing until the mid 2000 or early 2000, and then dramatically declined. This decline, this out phase, was actually counterbalanced by a phase of increasing domestic value addition. As you can see, the growth rates, the average growth rates in these periods, and the then phase in which the country was able to go back out in the global economy with a huge amount of technological content. And this led to fundamentally a shift in the last 10, 15 years in terms of the kind of products that China is able to export. When you compare this experience with other countries, let's take Mexico, for example, or South Africa in a second, you see that these are countries where the foreign value added has increased. So these countries have been much more integrated with the value chains. But when you look at their engagement backwards, so their capacity to engage domestically with, so the linking back part and increasing value addition, this is, in the case of Mexico, the lowest increase in domestic value addition across all OECD countries. So in a way, this is a clear factor that distinguishes the experience of those successful industrializers vis-a-vis those that didn't manage to do so, or managed to get involved into the value chain, but without transforming their domestic economy. Now, as I mentioned, many of these problems in terms of adding domestic value addition are due to the fact that fundamentally with the increasing complexity of products, the content, the technological content, the capacity to master the technologies by the companies in these countries face several institutional challenges. And these challenges are due to the fact that even if the government try to increase the amount of investment in basic research, often the amount of resources that is needed in intermediate stages of development of the technology is lacking. And also there are very few companies downstream towards more the commercialization, deployment of the technology that are able to pick up this capacity. Now, in the, if you want, more advanced economy setting, this idea of value of debt has been used also in the UK, Europe, and so on in the US to actually signal the need to support interventions in the intermediate stages of the technology development path. In the case of many developing countries, the problem has been that all these different segments of development of technologies were chronically underfunded, and also more the companies that were towards the end of these stages of development of the technologies were unable to pick up innovation. It's not that in many of these countries there is no technological innovation, that innovation doesn't translate into products and new services. Now, countries use different type of industrial policy in different successful way or non-successful way, trying to address these gaps. You know, if you think about things like the InnoFund in China, things like the MSEF, which was a manufacturing a matching grant scheme for manufacturing investment, or the use of intermediate institutions like EMBRAPA. These were all initiatives that over time countries of the last 20, 30 years have been trying to deploy exactly to fundamentally create conditions to keep pace with the technological change. Now, the interesting thing is that if we think about the experience of China, this is, fund and many others are just one of the many instruments. If we look at the experience of EMBRAPA in Brazil, it's probably one of the most successful instruments that the government deployed and strengthened, in particular after also the Lula first productive development plan in 2002. But there were countries like South Africa who tried to use instruments without major success in terms of deploying of these instruments. When we think about the case of South Africa, it's striking. We've done some work also in partnership with CRED a few years back, where Susan was mentioning the importance of working with government. We did a partnership with the Department for Trade and Industry, and we worked across several value chains, automotive, machine tools, mining equipment, and so on, which were also agro value chains, which were in a way giving us a sense of what was happening on the ground in South Africa, in many of these value chains, and why is that despite the opportunities the new technologies were offering, this country was and these companies were struggling to compete internationally. And many of the results that we could find were fundamentally results about the pointing to the fact that while you can find in many middle-income countries pockets of innovation and technological effort that companies are putting in place. This, in the picture of the book we published, is actually a technology produced in South Africa for the mining technology, mining equipment technology, from a company which we work with to understand their strategies, their engagement with the sector. These were, example of digitalization and advancement of technology, which were allowing this company to be internationally competitive. But these were very few examples in a, if you want, a general picture where most of the companies were fundamentally underinvesting. They were not able to sustain level of investment. As you can see from the chart on the side, South Africa has been similar to Brazil, but in particular, South Africa has been performing very poorly in terms of gross fixed capital formation. And this has happened while at the same time, many companies were profitable. So in a way, again, it's not that these countries don't generate in sufficient amount of profit in specific areas that could not be invested, but often the problem is that these resources are captured and in some cases are extracted through processes of financialization, which makes the entire ecosystem of firms very vulnerable when it comes to building up local linkages, building up depth in technologies. And of course, all these issues have been addressed over time by different set of instruments. And this became a sort of the standard instruments that all governments across middle-income countries have been looking at to try to revert this situation. And many of these instruments have been, there are very detailed cases which show how countries have used this instrument, even the same instruments, in very different ways. If you think about how China deployed basically all the full kit of industrial policy, the way in which these were designed and they were tailored to, adapted to the specific context, reveals not just the existence of standard forms of industrial policy, but a variety of ways of combining them, using them through different institutional mechanisms. Now, China, in the context of keeping pace with technological change, exactly because it was able to deploy all these different instruments, developed over the last 10 years, in particular with the launch of the Made in China 2025 and 2030, developed probably the fastest and most advanced leapfrog in many of the current technologies that determine the balance of power in a number of these value chain. We've done some work, for example, trying to identify how much China has become over this period the key node in digital production technologies. So we developed a technological classification which brings together around 130 products in 60 digit in trade. And we tracked the evolution of bilateral and multilateral trade in this technology. And the metrics that you identify points clearly to the fact that in many of these digital areas, and when we talk about digital, we are talking not simply about, of course, chips manufacturing and sensors and so on. We're talking about production technologies like robots, automation, and so on. China has fundamentally become capable to develop domestic parallel value chain that compete very fiercely within China to gain space in the domestic market, but also, of course, in the international market. We spent a couple of years looking at specifically how China, in fact, developed significant capabilities in the space of robot technologies, which are key technologies to improve productivity in a number of sectors. Today, there is a big discussion, for example, around how automotive producers in China are able to produce electric vehicles that are outcompeting in price and technology many of the equivalent producers in the West. And we often forget that this capability, it's not simply about the product, but it's about the production technologies that underpin the product itself. And we could find clear evidence that China has developed hubs of robot manufacturing by attracting the head of the value chains in robot technologies in the country, creating with industrial policy starting from 2017, as this chart shows before, creating this domestic value chain and fundamentally becoming now the first country in the world in terms of level of robotization using different parameters. Now, in this first part, what I try to flesh out is that the classical problems of industrialization and engagement with value chain have persisted over time. The middle-income countries have attempted to really engage and use industrial policy to turn these problems into opportunities for their transformation, but very, very few have managed to do so. And of course, the Chinese case is probably the most striking one, while there are pockets of positive outcome across other middle-income countries. I pointed out the case of South Africa, but fundamentally these are too small and too little to provide the kind of transformation that this country needs in terms of their productive structure. Now, all this leads or brings to the current scenario where while these countries are trying to use and deploy this industrial policy, the industrial policy reality and the competition around using industrial policy has fundamentally changed. Now, if we think about what we have been facing, not just in the last Trump administration, but already starting in the last 7-8 years since the Paris Agreement and the end of if you want, 2020, when Europe started bringing back a number of large interventions. The Biden administration introduced the IRA and other instruments. We have been seeing how fundamentally at the global level, the superpowers had regained confidence in using not just China, but also the US and EU, in using large injection of finance into key areas of technologies, infrastructure, and so on. Now, in this space of more assertive industrial policy, it's become much more clear that a number of tensions across country and conflicting interests across them make very difficult for this country to reconcile, if you want, the provision of a public good, for example, joint investment or international investment in addressing climate change, with very nationalist interest. And probably now we are facing the full-fledged version of this neo-mercantilism, where protectionism, coming in particularly from the existing hegemon, the US, is basically triggering a number of rounds of tit for tat, retaliation that are becoming more and more targeted around specific products and countries. So this is a very different environment from the one in which countries were trying to engage with industrial policy in their structural transformation issues in the 90s or early 2010. In this kind of context, it's also striking to see how not only the US is using, of course, protectionist measure, but other countries around the world are trying to become indispensable nodes in many value chain. All the discussion around shortage of critical minerals points to the fact that China, not only in the technology areas of digital I was referring to, but more critically in the upstream industry, was very much ahead of the curve in becoming the key dominant player in particularly mid stages of critical minerals beneficiation and value chain. And in doing that, they have become indispensable nodes for these materials and industries to develop. Now, in this context, you see that as in particular, the Trump's protectionist shock is creating a significant concern across countries, in particular the most vulnerable one. We have done work in terms of trying to measure the shock of the Trump impact on countries like South Africa, Egypt, Morocco. These are all countries for which we have more detailed data on domestic value addition. And it's clear how these tariffs are going to have are going to generate shocks both directly on the specific product, but upstream and downstream in many of these industries. If you look at South Africa, for example, the key effort that the government put in place over the last 15, 20 years to promote the automotive value chain could be dramatically affected by reduced access to the US market. And these interventions are becoming very not just product specific, but very company specific, because not all companies in the automotive value chain in South Africa are, for example, exporting to the US market. So those who are focused on the US market by the introduction of this tariff fundamentally become unviable businesses. Similarly, when we think about the CBAM or other interventions introduced by the EU, we can see similar type of shocks in terms of the capacity of countries like South Africa to engage. So this kind of change in the scenario has very deep implication in terms of what countries can do with their industrial policy. Now, we can look at these issues in...
Antonio, about 5-7 minutes left. Okay.
Yeah. We can look at these issues from different angles. We can look at how countries have fundamentally reacted to these industrial policy measures. But fundamentally, what we observe is that most middle-income countries, as stressed from the beginning, have struggled to engage with this new reality, partially because they have not used industrial policy for many years. So many governments have lost capacity in deploying industrial policy. And secondly, because often their industrial policy has been articulated starting from very standard measures or very high-level aspirational goals, which do not translate into effective intervention. For example, there has been an increasing recognition that we need to have more conditionalities attached to industrial policy, but there is very little understanding of how this conditionality can be fundamentally enforced. So in this context, what we've been trying to do is to try to understand how to learn from the experience of countries from the past who managed to use industrial policy effectively. And in particular, what we learn from their experience is that China, Korea, many countries, they did not simply deploy standard forms of industrial policy. They actually innovated the way the instruments can be used by starting from a focus on the specific set of functions that instruments that can perform. Now, this sounds quite an abstract concept, shifting from forms to functions, but effectively it's a key, if you want, step towards opening the policy space for many countries. Lots of traditional standard instruments until recently were not even allowed. Many of these instruments require significant finance that some of these countries do not cannot finance because they don't have enough fiscal capacity. So the issue is to become much more open to instruments that go beyond the standard toolkit and focus them around specific functions. Let me be concrete. We identify in some work that we are now under review, we identify 5 specific set of functions that can be met with very different type of instruments. And in fact, many of these instruments can be used to achieve multiple functions at the same time. So when you start moving from simply deploying, let's say, a procurement instrument or a subsidy, and you start thinking about how these instruments have a functional impact on the economy, which can be going in the right direction or in the wrong direction, and how many other policy, for example, competition policy, can have the same impact that instruments, traditional industrial policy instruments have, then you start opening up a complete new approach to the set of instruments that you deploy, how you align them, and how you manage them to achieve the outcomes that you are trying to achieve as a government. Now, we have been trying to deploy this kind of approach, and the first thing that we realized that when we try to look at the different forms and functions that countries are using, and the reason why often they deploy standard forms and they struggle to implement and enforce the policy, it's of course fundamentally a political economy problem. And the political economy problem is that the national state try to define, when they are capable to do so, try to define the right set of mix of industrial policy instruments. They try to identify a set of functions that are relevant, but effectively in doing that, they have to negotiate dramatically with both international players and domestic players. And this kind of, if you want, situation raise concern around who is really calling the shots when it comes to, for example, procurement policy, or when it comes to finance for a specific type of investment. And here we are seeing how, for example, in the context of the green transition, many of the resources that at the international level were mobilized to support governments in the global south to deal with climate change and the green transition, they come with the wrong type of conditionality that reduce the policy space for the national state to actually deploy their industrial policy. Similarly, what we find is that often domestic firms and global firms have the upper hand in many of these negotiations, in many of these national industrial policy design. Let me skip this, but we have few cases that have already shown how this kind of mechanism work. We have looked at how Namibia has been brought into thinking about green hydrogen, and how in fact the entire investment around green hydrogen seems to have stalled last November, when the government and was informed that the German government and companies were no more interested in making this large investment, which means that impacted significantly the whole functioning of the industrial policy in the country, which was geared towards supporting this large investment. We have seen similar cases where the wind procurement, the public procurement for wind energy generation in South Africa didn't materialize in terms of the match between the instruments used by the government and the needs that international companies had to make investment viable in the country. And we are seeing increasingly that now in those very difficult to abate industries like steel, like chemicals, fertilizer, where large multinationals, these are sectors where the scale economies are large and they are dominated by large multinationals. These multinationals are fundamentally using their power to force governments in the countries to fundamentally allocate rents to the incumbents, more than creating space for new companies to disrupt the existing technological paradigms and open space for more competitive market. I'll stop there, and I'm sure that Rina will pick up a lot around competition issues, especially in South Africa.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Bang on time with our 5 minutes start. So that's great. It's always difficult for me to have the bad guy role of saying you need to stop now. So you did it very well. Thank you so much. Let me introduce Rina directly then, and we'll take questions afterwards. So Professor Rina Dasner is the Executive Director of the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development, an Associate Professor and Program Coordinator in the Master of Commerce in Competition Economic Regulation degree at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. And she was, before that, engaged in non-profit research organizations, also with Government Competition Commission, and also worked with consultancy as consultancy in economics in various domains, but mainly our areas of research interest include competition dynamics in the grocery retail sector, global, regional, and domestic food value chains, and with a focus on barriers to entry for small and medium-sized and women-owned enterprises and alternative routes to market in food systems. So hopefully we'll have both an academic and practitioner view on the topic that Antonio has developed. And the floor is yours. So about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes of discussion. Thank you, Rina.
Great. Thanks, Jerome, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this seminar series. I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I'm also very pleased that I could hear Antonio talk about some of his more recent work, which I think is really exciting in this space. So yes, thank you, Antonio, for sharing your insightful research. First of all, around the kind of earlier work you've done on the middle income technology trap, which I think links beautifully with the new work that you're doing now around possible reasons why countries continue to be stuck in this middle income technology trap. And I think the work that you're doing, the kind of newer work that you're doing, you listed a series of papers that are work in progress, I think greatly contributes to the emerging literature that's coming out on the intersection between global value chains and industrial policy. And I think from the beginning of your session, you talked about the challenge faced, particularly in the industrial policy literature, around the focus that has been primarily around forms of industrial policy rather than the functions that the institutions performing industrial policy should engage in. And I think this is quite an important distinction. And like you said, it might be a bit of a fuzzy concept to explain very, very quickly. I know I had to read it in the context of what you were talking about a couple of times, but maybe just to emphasize that when we're talking about policy forms, you're really talking about what institutions are and how they're linked to different policy instruments or tools that are available. But when you're talking about policy functions, you're talking primarily about what institutions do and importantly for me, why they do what they do. So this naturally makes the kind of lens a little bit broader in scope than just focusing on the forms. And I think this is really, really important, particularly given the shifts that you've talked about, the technological and digital transformations that we're seeing, the climate emergency, of course, green transitions, and of course, all the geopolitical shifts that you put some charts up to illustrate the impacts to countries like South Africa. So I think given these kind of structural shifts that we're seeing, having this broader lens to look at industrial policy, why it may have not succeeded in lifting countries out of the middle income trap becomes very important to design better policies going forward and also to fix, if possible, mistakes that have previously been made. So I think today my inputs are twofold and I think fairly brief. First, I want to just talk about a few points that's kind of stood out in your presentation. And I've also had the privilege of reading preliminary drafts of your new research, which was great. So thank you for that. And to really just support some of the way you've positioned or support your position and framing of these issues around form versus function. And then secondly, I hope it'll be of some interest if I share some of my own insights from my own research. And I think as I talk through these, you'll see that they're quite closely aligned with some of the themes that you've discussed today. Although the sectors that I talk about are quite different. You've been talking about high technology automotive sectors and various others. And I'm talking about food and agro-processing, which I think many of you here will know can also be industrial, quite industrially intensive. So I think it's quite nice that, as I was reading through your work, I could immediately make links to my work and my research that I've undertaken. And this is both in the academic space, but also with my engagements with policymakers, such as the Department of Trade and Industry, and my work at the Competition Commission, focusing on the competition angle. So again, just to go back a little bit, your framing of form versus function is very important, particularly given the changes that we've seen. And I think one of the big things, and we didn't have time to look at it properly in your chart, was that forms and functions do not necessarily have a one-to-one relationship. You can have a particular form of industrial policy or a tool that can fulfill multiple functions. It can deal with the objective of building domestic capabilities. It can deal with the objective, hopefully, of unemployment, which is something that South Africa faces. It can deal with the objective of wanting to increase export revenue. So there are forms or tools that can deal with multiple functions, and the other way around as well. You can have a single function that can be achieved through various tools. So I think you set that out quite nicely. You didn't have much time to talk about it in this presentation. But the important point, I think, about that and framing it in the way that you framed it, is that it kind of opens up the possibilities of industrial policy engagement. You're not kind of limited to a particular tool, import tariff, for example, or development of finance, or export restrictions. You're not just limited to one tool, but you're able to kind of look at alternative arrangements that might have more appetite for actors in the space. And I think this is a really important point. And I'm going to come to an example where I faced this sort of personally when I was working with different actors around policy issues. So I think your framing also recognizes the role of key actors, the power asymmetries, which Jerome introduced at the beginning, of different actors, whether it's firms in a value chain, whether it is extraterritorial, international government actors. All of them have different forms of power that affect the trajectory of development. The other thing I think is really important, you highlight this interconnected nature of systems, which requires coordination. And again, I think your framework kind of allows for that. It allows you to look at how different systems are connected and the different kind of policy tools are available. So I think you term it system interdependencies, which I think captures it quite well. In the work that you're doing, or at least the work that's coming out, what really struck me, and you put those examples up briefly, and you talked about the Namibian example around developing green energy, green hydrogen. What really struck me when you were doing, talking about the Namibian experience and the South African experience around wind-generated energy was really the issue of power. And it was power manifested in two forms. In the South African example, it was a dominant firm, a state-owned utility, that essentially put a spanner in the works and prevented, kind of wind turbine power generation to reach its full potential. And this was obviously because of its structure, and I'm talking about Eskom, the power utility. It's about its structure and the financial incentives that it had. So that's a clear case of how a dominant firm, in this case a state-owned utility, a powerful firm, essentially a quasi-monopolist, is able to affect the development trajectory of green energy. In the Namibian example, the power comes from a different source. The power comes from external big buyers, in this case, the EU, and particularly Germany. And that's also interesting because that dictates the development trajectory in Namibia. And there is that dependency on demand, or demand from EU. So for me, identifying those two power dynamics in very different forms has already told us quite a lot about how these industries can develop. So then I've asked myself, is a lesson then at the very minimum, before we even embark on designing industrial policy, we have to understand the various power dynamics that shape the value chain and the risks that they pose. So in the example that you gave, you said that projects in Namibia were cancelled because, I think Germany cancelled offtake agreements, perhaps. So again, understanding these ex ante make it, we're not going to get it right, but it'll make it, hopefully easier to design more useful tools. And again, I think your framework then allows us to do this, which I find quite interesting. There's of course still going to be tension. I mean, in the case of South Africa, the need for affordable renewable energy quickly, because we've of course had very big power crises in the past years. The need for affordable, quick, clean energy versus the localization requirements was a tension. Because on the one hand, if you want affordable energy, prices need to be low. But on the other hand, you don't incentivize, with low prices, you don't incentivize firms to invest in developing local capabilities. So I think these kind of dilemmas are really, really difficult to solve. And I'm not sure you have an answer for that. I don't think any of us do. But I think, again, your framework takes it a step closer to being able to answer things like this. What I did find interesting, and I think you didn't have a chance to talk about this, in the case of Namibia, developing alternatives to demand from the EU. So, for example, developing regional value chains within Africa is an interesting way to soften the power or soften the bargaining power available to a large lead buyer. And I think this is something I've done, I've done some research on regional value chains in the context of food, and developing these alternative value chains then kind of reduces the ability to push down prices, for example, or to cancel contracts and kind of leave an industry in a bad state. So I think that's a really, really interesting angle, which I hope your paper will take further. But then just to now take this into some of the work that I'm doing, and a lot of the work that I do is about power imbalances, right? So it's power imbalances between firms at the same level of the value chain, power imbalances along a value chain between buyer and seller. And I've focused a lot on the role of competition policy as a complement to industrial policy to deal with these differing power dynamics. Because there is, of course, no point supporting industries, for example, if you think about light manufacturing industries that supply household goods and products. There's no point supporting those industries if they can't, for instance, get their product to market. So if their routes to market are blocked. And routes to market can be blocked in various ways, as we know. I've done a lot of work around how the supermarketization trend, which is the growth of large supermarket chains, kind of become gatekeepers to end consumers, and can potentially create bottlenecks from new players entering the market and accessing customers. So this complementarity between policy, which is nothing new, I mean, this is not something I think everybody here knows about this, is so important when you're designing policies to reach certain objectives. Of course, competition policy alone cannot fix everything. And I think in some work that Antonio has done in the steel sector, that comes out very well. And I, unfortunately, in my previous life, worked on those cases when I was at the Competition Commission. And I have to admit, I don't think we've got the outcomes that we wanted to. And that's because competition policy, in terms of using competition policy to deal with steel pricing, when you had a former state-owned monopoly that's very embedded in the state even now, may not be the best tool. However, there are still options, and there's still avenues through which you can create what we call competition-friendly industrial policy. And I think, again, my example of supermarkets is I want to draw on that a little bit. And although it's obvious, the kind of trajectory of food value chains in South Africa is a bit different from sectors like steel. We also have a situation where our agricultural markets were formerly heavily regulated. And even after privatization and liberalization, you still had lead firms in many key food value chains. And these value chains continue to remain very concentrated many years after. And there's been a record of competition cases and investigations that show that building capabilities of small entrants, participation of small and medium-sized enterprises, which is a big objective for South Africa, has been hindered by these anti-competitive practices. A good example that I want to take through, and I'm not sure what my time is like, is the supermarketization example.
You've got about 5 minutes. So.
That's perfect. So the supermarketization example, I think, really brings these issues together. So what could a competition-friendly industrial policy intervention look like in the grocery retail space, for example, or in food value chains? So in the case of South Africa, you have large supermarket chains. You've got 4 or 5 very big supermarket chains that are primarily South African owned and that have spread into the Southern African region. So these are now regional players. They are very powerful players. They determine the food value chain. They determine the players that participate in terms of suppliers of both food products, fresh food products, processed food products, and household consumables. They, of course, through that, they impact investments and upgrading for those that want to meet those that want to supply through supermarket chains and who need to meet those requirements. So perhaps before I go into that, the procurement policies of supermarkets then become very, very important. And if industrial policy objectives are to build capabilities in agriculture, for instance, investments in climate-friendly agricultural production, capabilities in food processing, or trying to increase SMME participation in order to sort of deconcentrate markets, this is going to be less impactful if they don't deal with the power of supermarkets. So there's no point investing in those kinds of support if you don't deal with the power of supermarkets, which in the South African case dominate urban retail sales and are increasingly penetrating to rural and peri-urban areas. And as I said earlier, also moving into the region. So here's an example of where the complementarities of industrial policy and competition policy might be able to deal with some of these bottlenecks. And again, Antonio, going back to your framework, as I was looking at your matrix, I found, there were quite a few cells in there. I could say, this is where a policy intervention might be useful through different approaches in your functional form of functional industrial policy example. The supermarketization example is also a good one of industrial policies having a regional lens, as opposed to just having a domestic lens or with an objective of entering global markets. So again, going back to the example of green hydrogen that Antonio raised, and I had mentioned this earlier, if you can develop alternative markets, you might reduce your dependency on one big buyer. And in the case of regional value chains, if you have more suppliers that are able to participate in supermarket value chains, that can also affect the bargaining position of supermarkets as they procure. So what would a functional approach to industrial policy kind of be in this case? It would mean appreciating the power asymmetries in food value chains, at the beginning, which I think, again, is not controversial. I think there is acceptance. And then maybe interventions in industrial policy will try and equalize the bargaining power of supermarket chains by supporting, for example, independent retailers, supporting fresh produce markets, supporting alternatives, which is very similar to the Namibian case. Of course, this is much harder to address if it's in global value chains. South Africa exports processed food products and fresh fruit products into global markets. And the increasing or the growing sustainability standards and the proliferation of sustainability standards that are imposed by importing countries, primarily from the global north, makes it quite difficult for new entrants to meet these standards in the supply chain. So this goes back to Antonio's first point in his earlier work around, makes it hard to break into the GVC itself, having to meet all these different sustainability standards. And it also kind of leads to a concentration further upstream of larger players that are able to meet these standards and invest to meet these standards, dominating at different levels of the value chain. So this is, of course, harder because national policies can't determine global behavior. In the case of competition, the South African Competition Authority cannot impose conditions of buying to the UK supermarkets that buy our wine or that buy our citrus, and that makes it quite challenging. And I think Antonio also mentioned these requirements are just increasing. We're talking about the EU Green Deal, we're talking about CBAM, we're talking about the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, quite a mouthful. So all of these put pressure on industrialization objectives in the global south, and it's quite hard to balance the different policy mixes that are required to deal with this. Jerome, I think I'm going to stop there. I think my 5 minutes is up.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rina.
Thank you.
Excellent discussion, and great to see the parallels on between both your research on different aspects or industries, but actually all the similarities in terms of the the elements that are needed to understand how progress can be made. I will open the floor, and I know that Antonio, you probably will want to respond to some of Rena's point, but we could probably take a few questions and then model them, mold them into an answer. There are quite a few questions in the chat. Maybe Beverly Orton, if she's still around, you had two questions that you wrote. If you want to re-ask them verbally, or I can read them, depending on whether you want to reframe them. That could be.
I can ask them.
Yeah.
The thing that I always find interesting about South Africa is, it has a massive problem, A, of unemployment, B, of education and access to education and access to technical knowledge without the outrages and outages and all these other words which Eskom likes to call these things. In actual fact, you just don't have electricity, boom, but they don't want to say that, but that's, or you don't have water, or you don't have this, or you don't have that. Okay, so I just feel that, the policies that are being made are like, they're skidding along the issues because they're not taking actual cognizance of the actualities of the people who live in South Africa, and who and especially in issues of like gender and so the policies are made like at the top, but it's at the top and it's not coming down. And this is the whole issue to do with the power support. And I just wanted to know, something along that line. And then also, about the automotive parts, like where are we going to send these to? Are we sending them to X, Y, or Z? Or are we going to try and build up a whole regional sort of, where we go into Africa, and what are we doing with that? So I think it's a really difficult sort of situation, and I just feel that when policies are made, they do not include the people on the ground. They do just not include the people on the ground, and they definitely do not include the voices of the women who actually provide so much structure and so much a backbone into the economy of South Africa.
Thank you, Beverly. That's great indeed, and great to bring the gender dimension in the whole picture. There was also a question by Ikyung Lee. They wrote their questions in the chat. I can read that because they're quite detailed. Unless you want to talk to them directly, Ikyung Lee.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, thank you for today's seminar. I'm master student, so I think I don't have like deep understanding yet about global value chain. But I've been wondering, because like I understand industrial policy is very much important in terms of like maintaining supply chain, and I'm from Korea, so I witnesses all the like rapid development and so on. But at the same time, I feel like this right now international stage is really unstable. So I think more like beyond industrial policy is not really like, since industrial policy is not flexible in my mind, so I think like relationship between countries is more influence on the consistency of the development. So I would like to ask about this for the first question. And the second question is about regional supply chain, because I studied vertical integration of the upper value chain in East Africa. And in my mind, I feel like to construct regional value chain in Africa, there the relationship between countries is also important. So I'd like to ask like how these studies consider this factor, like the relationship between the countries within the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone who wants to raise the hand? Otherwise, I'll give the floor to Antonio and then Rina. So we had a question on education, employment, and gender, and then questions on the importance of inter-country relationship and trade agreements rather than necessarily industrial policy per se per country, and the vertical value chain in East Africa, and supply chain stability. And then obviously, Antonio, if you want to address some of Rina's point directly, feel free. And then we'll take another round of questions if we have time. Thank you. Go ahead.
Shall I go first then?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jerome. Thanks everyone for engaging with the discussion, and thanks Rina for the excellent discussion. In a way, we've been in conversation for many years now, so we share a number of concerns, but also I think what I've been trying to emphasize, and I think your comments further stressed, highlighted, is the fact that it's a complex set of issues, right? Because we've moved from looking at countries, we're looking at value chain. We use different units of analysis, and in each of them, the way in which we understand, we frame the problem might be, reducing quite a lot of the possible answer to the problem, right? So if we don't see certain dimension in terms of, for example, we use industrial policy, but we capacitate companies that are operating in highly concentrated markets, that capacitation doesn't lead anywhere, right? And so on and so forth. And yes, I didn't go into the detail of the cases, but as you pointed out, these are cases where what we are trying to do is to create a battery of different cases which allow to see how power really operate, right? And doesn't simply operate in a general sense. The company or the government is lobbying the Namibian government or South African government and so on, but really try to look at what is the mechanism through which power is exercised, right? Is it the specific type of climate fund model of blended finance that goes in a certain way? Is it the way in which the procurement law has been designed? By the way, in some cases, the government can get it completely wrong, right? Can also over push their position of power in the sense of try to impose very strict conditionalities that are not that no company can meet. And result is that company pull out, right? Or vice versa, can target the wrong type of things for local content requirement, right? There are discussion around the extent to which in South Africa makes sense. For example, in the SAREM, which is the South African Renewable Master Plan, it makes sense to try to replace capacity in solar panel production or in components for building up the grid or wind turbines, right? So if someone understands how different these technologies are, they, in designing the procurement, might realize that actually solar panel is fundamentally a commodity and the price is determined by scale, right? So either you can beat on scale or you really need to leapfrog into complete new materials but for that, like perovskite and so on, for that you need very advanced technological capabilities, R&D and so on, right? So this kind of trade-off in designing instruments, I think it's what we are trying to flesh out with this analytical concept of functions and forms, right? Because the form often just focus on deploying instruments that we know they work, a minimum amount of local content requirement, but we don't see if that instrument it's really getting what we want to achieve, right? So you might use other instruments that actually give you the outcome of that. And I've been involved in South Africa in some master plan design work and so on. And this kind of problem of design, which is not simply an abstract concept, is really about how you put the tariff on the place, how you create conditions for procurement, what are the threshold of the policy design, have very dramatic result. Now, going to the questions, to the first question, thanks so much for raising, of course, I tried to bring together lots of different dimensions, but it's impossible to cover everything in 40 minutes. I mean, the problem around employment, and in fact, just today during this seminar, I was supposed to be in a Presidential Economic Advisory Council, but I had committed to give the seminar, so I couldn't cut that. But I know that my colleagues with President Ramaphosa were discussing issues also connected to, of course, the usual eternal problem that South Africa, even in areas where they were able to do achieve relatively good outcome, like in automotive and in other areas, the success in some export of citrus and other type of high-value products in the agricultural sector. Despite all these areas, they are fundamentally still struggling with key foundational issue. I mean, you mentioned the energy sector. Again, the energy sector is not even about not having electricity. I mean, we studied a few years back South Africa in terms of capacity on the plant of generating electricity has more than what it needs. The problem is that these plants operate at 30-40% because for many years, the money that was supposed to go to support and keep the machinery of the energy generation working were actually diverted in different way. It became part of a rent capture exercise, right? So again, the understanding the nature of the problem is critical. Similar in the case of skills and education. We've done quite a lot of work, not just in South Africa, but also in other countries like Tanzania, for example, where we have looked at, what is the problem with skills formation? Because the usual idea is that we don't have enough educated people. But actually, going back to Alice Amsden, this kind of narrative, it's always affected by a supply side bias, right? The idea that if you supply more skills, the economy will improve. But the reality in many of these countries is that it's not a supply side problem, it's a demand side problem. There are not enough capable firms that can hire and reward skills and train people on the job and reward these people with increasing salary, incentives, and motivate them to be productive within this organization. So education system has gone in a very specific direction. We have gaps in what they are called the CETAs and all the technical vocational education that, of course, needs to be filled. But this is not going to be solved with the current institutional arrangement. For those who have studied how skills training work across many Southern Eastern African countries is through levies attached to the payroll of companies. These levies are called skills levies, and they are used to channel resources towards the vocational training institution. But this kind of mechanism often create problems for employment, because if you put a tax on the payroll, which is a tax that is independent if you're making money or not, so it's a fixed cost, right? So you actually discourage formal employment. And also there is no real incentive to make companies working closely with this vocational training institution to create the practical skills that are needed to make people employable, right? Again, understanding how the institutions have been designed, how the mechanism and the incentive operate, can help us in thinking, okay, how do we move forward? What kind of other policy solution we can introduce to address, of course, the employment problem, the creating appropriate skill, and of course, embedding into many of these intervention measures that are supporting like the Black economic empowerment, gender, and so on and so forth. But without understanding the nature of the problem, deploying, again, a standard solution, a bit more resources in education, just normally generate more people leaving the country. There is a big problem of brain drain of a technical level of people who go to other countries to find jobs that require the skills that they have, and doesn't really resolve the problem on the ground. On the regional integration issue, over the last few years, actually before COVID, at SOAS, we were running a large program on anti-corruption evidence, the ACE program, and I was leading that program with Mushtaq Khan and Pallavi Roy. And one of the areas we looked specifically was regional integration in East Africa. And why is that it's so difficult to generate trade complementarities, even in regions like East Africa, where Rina has done lots of work there as well, where we know there's been the strongest attempt to create regional integration, partially because of the East African community was designed as a custom union, and because all the countries that are there, Kenya through COMESA and Tanzania through SADC, are also part of larger blocks of integration. Now, the big problem is that normally when you try to develop this regional value chain, the positioning of countries in the regional value chains become the most contested issue. And what normally countries do is to sign agreements that excludes those products that are more politically problematic, right? So if you read the East African Community tariff and the products that enter into the so-called SI, the sensitive items, those that are exempt from the custom arrangement, what you find is that products like sugar, like rice, key commodities that are also political commodities because they are essential for running the political economy of this country. Let me not go more into the detail. These are all exempt from these regional agreements. So in a way, the areas where you could have more opportunity for building complementarities are those that politically are blocked because countries are concerned about either losing an advantage in these areas or the possibility in the future to build their capacity. A few years back, I was working in Ethiopia with the government, and they've been concerned about the free trade continental agreement in Africa. At that time, they were looking at strategies to develop pharma industry. Was, of course, that they were joining that. They would be flooded by drugs coming from Egypt because Egypt has lots of capacity in pharma. This is just an example. In East Africa, there has been conversation around who is going to get the right sector and segment of the value chain for many, many years. And this becomes even more complicated when, of course, there is a dominant player, when you have someone like South Africa involved, because while complementarity exists, they might actually be perceived as the regional dominant player taking them over.
Thank you, Antonio. Rina, do you want to chip in on any of these questions?
Yes, maybe just picking up on that last point around regional value chains, and that's a really good question. And the comment around relationships between countries matter, and it's so important. And we've seen this. I mean, our research has looked at possibilities of developing food value chains, different types of food value chains, for example, animal feed to poultry. Currently, South Africa imports a lot of its poultry products, and we don't have the right climatic conditions to grow the maize and the soy necessary to make animal feed. But our neighbors to the north, Zambia, do. They've got enough water. They can grow these products and convert them to animal feed, which could potentially supply the region and kind of create some sort of import substitution. But there are tensions. There are tensions. Antonio raised this. There's perceptions about dominant countries, and South Africa is considered a dominant country in the region and in the continent. And countries want to protect their own domestic markets, even if those domestic industries, even if those domestic industries are not necessarily efficient or kind of sustainable in the long run. And then there's all the political lobbying that happens around that. So it makes it really difficult, even with the Continental Free Trade Area agreement, where borders are supposed to be open and regional value chains are supposed to kind of flourish. It makes it really difficult. I think recently Botswana imposed tariffs on certain food products. So even within the SADC region, there are forms of both tariff and non-tariff barriers that are raised, which make it even harder, I guess, to develop regional value chains. So I think that really is the challenge. How do we deal with these relationships between countries to kind of break these barriers around developing regional value chains and kind of spurring on industrialization through that lens? And as I said earlier, creating an alternative market or an alternative route to market that allows for more bargaining power of suppliers. Then, if you don't mind, Jerome, I just want to talk about the gender issue that was raised by Beverly and the area of women participation in food value chains has been my most recent kind of area of research and interest. And Beverly, you're absolutely right. It's really hard to hear women voices in policy making in the food industry. And that's really because there's a strong push to maintain the status quo, right? The status quo works for the large firms often in highly concentrated markets, and there's an inertia to move away from that. I was part of a group that was discussing and kind of inputting into the agriculture and agro-processing master plan, and we looked at various food value chains, and really the representation of women-owned businesses was very, very low. And there's a number of issues around this. representation at the grassroots level, there's a lack of understanding of what various industrial policy tools and measures mean at the grassroots level. There's also a lack of understanding what the recourse is if, for example, a women entrepreneur can't get her product onto a supermarket shelf. There's very little information about whether and how she can approach the competition authorities if there is a buyer power or an abuse of buyer power issue. So we are trying to start to work more with entrepreneurs themselves directly, and then try and represent them at these policy making forums and put in, kind of provide inputs from their perspective. But I fully agree with you. The voices of women have been underrepresented in a lot of these policy discussions. And I can say this with confidence because I was part of one of these policy discussions, and it was really, really hard to get, kind of grassroots level women entrepreneurs in those debates. Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you, Rina. Is there any other question? I mean, we don't have much time, so we could also wrap up. I know that Susan wanted to present briefly the our next seminars, but it has been a really, really interesting discussion and presentation and understanding all the ramifications of, I see Beverly, maybe a final remark. I know you've commented on the chat. It is a tricky question, the gender issue, I agree.
This is an issue that really relates a lot to the work that I do in South Africa and my research, etc. But it's, it all comes down to this whole thing with power and men, and, this whole patriarchal and misogynistic views that people have of women being unable to do this. And one of my PhD students is doing an amazing work on actually just water, like the access to water and all these kind of things, and access to, I don't know, to all sorts of stuff. Anyway, I could go on for ages as well, and I'm going to stop because otherwise, Antonio will never get to the meeting and the forum that he has to go to. Okay, I'm sorry. And thank you very, very much, both of you, for really, really interesting seminar, because I'm actually a criminologist and a gender specialist, and I'm listening to all this value-laden stuff and everything, and it's really interesting. Yep, I think I'm going to become an economist now, or whatever it is that one becomes.
Political economist is the solution to understand the problems of the world. Thank you so much, Beverly.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I see that Susan is posting the agenda, actually. So, for those interested, could read quickly through this. But I really wanted to thank both presenters and discussants, Antonio and Rina, for an excellent seminar. Very interesting. I don't know much about the political economy of value, industrial policy, and global value chains, but I've learned a lot. And also, it speaks to my area of research on gender equality and care, investment, and in social infrastructure. So that the connections are everywhere, and it's really important that we keep those seminars to have conversations on all these different aspects. Thank you so much, everyone, and we see you on the next seminar in February.